Christina's worked awfully hard for us to have Dan here today under the circumstances of our getting him before his book actually comes out, although I have in my hand the very first copy, which is very, very exciting. And I want to say a few words about him from my brain, and then I want to talk about him from my body and my mind, my heart. So just for those of you who like to know these kinds of things, Daniel Siegel is clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine, co-director of the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center, and executive director of the MindSight Institute, a graduate of Harvard Medical School. He is co-author of 2 classic parenting books, Parenting from the Inside Out and The Whole Brain Child, and also the author of MindSight and the internationally acclaimed professional texts, The Mindful Brain and The Developing Mind. Dr. Siegel gives keynote addresses at conferences and conducts workshops around the world. Proud father of 2 children in their 20s, lives in Los Angeles with his wife. Now, Dan Siegel is one of my teachers. I have been studying Dan for quite some time. Those of you who are standing, we have plenty of seats. No, we don't have. We have some seats here. Please, it is okay to sit here at the table with me. Love to have you come on down. Just make yourself comfortable. So, I would take up too much time talking about the amazing journey of how my life has intersected with the teachings of Daniel. But let me just say that my wife and I read The Whole Brain Child, and we immediately ordered multiple copies, sent it to our children who are parents, and sent it to other friends. It's one of the handiest, most important books about child rearing and helping kids understand their own brains. And that's what Brainstorm now is doing for adolescents, for teenagers and the parents and loved ones of teenagers. And I just want to hold up MindSight. I preached from this morning. The story of Jonathan is told in, those of you who haven't been to the service, you'll have to come to hear the story of Jonathan. But the story of Jonathan is told in beautiful detail here, including one of the finest guides to meditation or mindfulness I've ever read. So, I stayed up all night one night when I was in Ireland after talking with John O'Donoghue's brother about Daniel. And I found out that he had been a teacher of the Dalai Lama, Daniel, and that he had all this stuff to do, and that he was doing these courses over in Santa Monica, which I promptly registered for, and so now I'm an official student of Dr. Daniel Siegel. And I couldn't be happier to welcome and ask you to join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Daniel Siegel.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to also thank Vromans for being here and supporting getting the book out, and my wonderful co-author, Tina Payne-Bryson. Where are you, Tina? Tina and I, we co-authored The Whole Brain Child together, and it's really an honor to be here with you and your family. And so thank you all for coming. What we're going to talk about today, just so I have the time boundaries, I'll do a half an hour talking, then we'll have a fun discussion. Is that about right?
We all disappear.
We all disappear. Okay, wow, all right. Yes, and except if you wanted signatures. Okay, wonderful. So what I want to do is just talk to you. There's some amazing new findings from the science of the adolescent developmental period that I just want to summarize for you, and it's what we just heard about this idea of how you can approach development by looking at the mind, the brain, and the body, and relationships in new kinds of ways. This view comes from a field I work in called interpersonal neurobiology, and for those of you who want some seats, there's some seats right here if you'd like. So just come on up. You're not going to, I won't be bothered. You may bother other people, but it's totally fine. Come on up. Come on up here. There's some seats right here and back here too, if you don't mind being in the back. So the idea from this view of interpersonal neurobiology, just so you have the setting, is we take every field of knowledge and we try to bring them together into one perspective. So it started out with the field of science, where we basically took everything from mathematics and physics to psychology and sociology and anthropology and things like biology and chemistry, everything, and we pulled them together into one point of view. And that's called interpersonal neurobiology. I edited a series of books where we have now 36 textbooks if you like to read the details of all that stuff. But the issue, the reason I'm bringing that up is that since the beginning of that field, interpersonal neurobiology, it's been amazing to see how other ways of knowing, like spirituality and religion, like the arts and music, like deep understandings of meditation and contemplative practice, how all those ways of knowing, which have their own wonderful discipline to them, are now beginning to join within interpersonal neurobiology. So one of my students, Kurt Thompson, just wrote a book looking at the interpersonal neurobiology aspects of the New Testament, called The Anatomy of the Soul. We have people that were mentioned, the Dalai Lama. I was once asked to speak to Pope John Paul II to talk about these issues, because the idea is couldn't there be a way of exploring one truth? That if you're disciplined about exploring that truth, then you'll find different aspects of it. So because I have had two kids who used to be young, and they used to let me write about them in my books, for those who read any of the books that Tina and I wrote, or I wrote with Mary Hartzell, Parenting from the Inside Out, they actually asked me not to do much of that anymore because they're older and they know better. But because I've had these kids grow up, my wife and I were really trying to approach raising them with an interpersonal neurobiology approach. And when I was talking especially with my daughter about her adolescence and her brother, who's 24 now, I really got interested in seeing what is known in the popular culture about adolescence. What do we learn from things we read in magazines or newspapers, what we see on TV, and what do we know from popular books that we read as parents, versus what's known in science. And the first thing that happened in preparing this book, Brainstorm, was a kind of shocking reality, which is that what we know in popular parenting circles is actually very different from what science tells us. And these differences weren't just the fact that we're being told things that aren't true. It came to be clear that what we're being told is actually destructive if you believe it. So then I thought, oh my gosh, then it would be really important for an adolescent who's told these things to have the truth available to them, and that it might be important also for adults who care for adolescents, parents, other caregivers, coaches, teachers, therapists, to actually hear what the real story is. So I reviewed basically all of the science of the adolescent period, including adolescent brain development, and compared it to what I was reading in the popular literature. And I'm going to set out what those myths are, and we'll debunk them right here, and then look a little bit at the brain. And, you know, those of you who, like Ed, are my people who I consider my colleagues, that we go on the journey together to understand things, know I usually can talk for about 8 hours, much to my family's dismay. So I'm gonna really tighten it down because we don't have 8 hours. But so I'm gonna just give you the highlights. And you know what my publisher said was, she said, and I'm gonna tell you straight because I never like to talk like this. And my wife said, just get over your problem, you know, which is that the publisher said, you know, there are 50,000 new titles that come out every year. And if you don't try to be a spokesperson for the ideas of this book, because you're so, you know, shy about saying, get this book, you know, then the book will die. And as you'll hear when you hear the message of the book, and the illustrator of the book is a young woman who told me on a phone call once, she goes, you really have a problem. I said, what's my problem? She goes, you are so like unwilling to stand up for what you believe in that, you know, because I said, I'm not going to push this book. It's so ridiculous, because no one ever asked me to do that before. This publisher is the first one to do it. So I said, okay, I got it. So I'll be a spokesperson for the ideas. So if you like these ideas, we can have a discussion about it. If you don't like the ideas, of course, that's fine. And I'll tell my wife you didn't like the ideas. So here are the myths. How many of you have heard that adolescence is a period of immaturity? Raise your hand. Yeah, it's a very, very common myth. And what I'm going to tell you is that that's wrong. And it's not only wrong, but when adults think of adolescence that way, or adolescents themselves think of themselves that way, it actually inhibits them from realizing their full potential. So instead of adolescence actually being a period of immaturity, what we now know is it's a period of brain transformation that's necessary for our whole human family, and that's necessary for the individual as well. So instead of it being immaturity, it's transformation that's necessary. The next myth you may have heard about, how many of you have heard that adolescents act the way they do because of raging hormones? You heard that? Raging hormones. Now, while it is true that hormones get to be higher in their amount because of puberty, the onset of sexual maturation, that's true. But there is no real correlation that's statistically significant between the kind of behavioral changes and thinking changes and emotional changes we see and hormones. It's just wrong. So what was discovered about 12 years ago, starting at UCLA, I'm proud to say, I also went to USC, so for those of you who were at the game, we won't worry too much. I can go either way. I'm ambi-campus-ly. What we know now is that it isn't raging hormones. It's actually brain remodeling. That's the answer, and we're going to go over that brain remodeling in just a few moments. But this difference leads to our third myth. So it's not immaturity, it's transformation. The third myth, and not so many people have heard about this, let me see if you've heard about it, is that adolescence is such a tough time of life, you just want to try to get through it as best you can. Anyone hear that? Yeah, you hear that. And the sad thing about that, as you'll see, is that there's an essence of adolescence that isn't something you should just get through. It's actually something you should cultivate during adolescence, and how you cultivate it during adolescence will affect the rest of your life. The other thing about this essence, which we're going to review soon, is that if you've let it go in your adulthood, it's never too late to get it back. And you could read this book as an adult, and you could actually get the essence back, which will actually, if you look at studies of the brain, make your brain younger and your body healthier. And we're going to talk about that soon. So it's not a period just to get through. It's actually a period to cultivate and hold on to as you go into adulthood, which is like so different from what we're told. The fourth and basically the final myth, which isn't such a common myth, but how many of you have heard that for an adolescent to really do the adolescent thing, they really need to push away from all adults in their life and get them out of life? People have heard it. It turns out that that's not true. It is true that adolescents need to push away from parent figures, which can be parents, of course, and other caregivers. It can be teachers. It can be all sorts of people. But we know that adolescents need some adult figures, healthy, supportive, trusting adult figures in their life. But in modern culture, that rarely happens. And so the need for adolescents to maintain adolescent-adult relationships outside of parent figures, not just parents, but parent-like adults, is crucial, and yet in our modern society, it's often not available. And so you see a lot of the problems that happen. In other species, when that happens, the young adolescents, for example, in elephants, if they don't have the adults around, they will destroy everything in their path. You just stick an adult around these adolescent elephants, and they stop being so destructive. So we need to have adults in our lives. Okay, so let's do a review of what actually happens instead of these myths. How do we understand these truths? And Ed Bacon was so kind, and the church was so kind. They have actually provided you with a model of the brain you can take home that's been taped under your bench or your seat. So if you reach under your chair, go ahead. It's going to be really sticky, the tape that's there. See if you can feel under there. And if you pull out your arm, you will find attached to your arm a hand. And this is your handout for today's talk. And my daughter says never say this, so don't tell her I said this. But this is a handy model of the brain. It's if you fold your fingers over your thumb, bend your thumb in and fold your fingers over, this brain would be oriented to your head like this. So it goes like this. right? So it's like that. So this is the model of the brain, and I'm just going to review the basic parts because in life it's useful to know it. You know, what do you formally like to be called, Ed? Ed, okay. Not Mr. Ed. Okay. All right, so as Ed mentioned, he mentioned the book Mindsight. In Mindsight, I talk about a patient whose created name is Jonathan, a young man who was an adolescent, who used the skills that are in this book, the Brainstorm book, to actually transform his ability to regulate his emotions, because he was developing very unregulated emotions, which led him to have all sorts of troubles in his life with his family, with his community, with his school, with his friends, with everybody. And so he was able to use these techniques. And this hand model of the brain is what I taught Jonathan. And I taught him how he can use his mind to change the connections in his brain. Now, when I used to say that back in the 90s, people would roll their eyes and they said, oh, yeah, right. And now we know it's completely true. It was a guess from inferred science, and now we have the empirical research to show that you can use your mind to change the structure and function of your brain. And what Tina Bryson and I did in the Whole Brain Child book was look at a fundamental concept called integration, which in interpersonal neurobiology we see as the linkage of differentiated parts that's the basis of health. So the simple way to say it is, if you have a system like, you know, a brain, or even a system like the relationships you have in a church or a community, you want to honor differences. So each person can have their own individual history. Each part of the brain can have its own individual techniques and processes and things that it does. But then you want to link them. So the linkage of differentiated parts means you're honoring differences and promoting linkages. And whether that's in a community or in a cortex, whether that's in a large society, or you're looking at synapses in the brain, the connections among neurons, the issue is, as that baby grows, what you want to do as a parent is have communication patterns that are integrative, where you honor differences and promote linkages. And amazingly, that promotes integration in the brain. Loving, attuned, compassionate communication among people promotes the growth of the fibers in the brain that are also connecting the differentiated parts with a kind of positive regard, if you will. So the left and right side of the brain are both treated with respect and then connected. So the simple statement is, integration is the basis of all what's called in science regulation. So if you want to regulate your attention, that is, have strong attention. If you want to regulate your emotions, which means balance your emotions. Or if you want to regulate your behavior, which means have kind, compassionate, respectful, empathic behavior. They're all based on integration. So the thing we teach about is that, amazingly, integrative communication between people, which is a compassionate life, creates integration in the brain. That's it. Any questions? So with that simple statement, then, what I thought in the Brainstorm book I wanted to do was to teach the hand model of the brain, which we're going to go over now. And the only reason, besides it being interesting, I mean, I'm kind of a science geek, so I'm interested, but as a clinician and as a parent and as a teacher, I want to make sure that the science comes to life, so that you're actually finding it useful. So what we now know is that if you know about the brain and know about its different parts, you can actually get the brain to grow, linking connections within it that help it. The scientific term is regulate it. The common term would just be to live a balanced life of meaning and connection and equanimity and clarity. Those are the things that come from integration. And so what I thought was that, in addition to debunking the myths, which we're about to do, what if there was a book that an adolescent could read, or anyone who once was an adolescent, for example, where they could actually develop more integration in their brain. So there's a systematic set of skills that you're taught in addition to the science and the stories. So the way it works, we go over the differentiated parts. So the reason you should know about these parts, and that's why the church has provided this model for you to take home, is so that when you know the different parts, you'll see how to link them. That's it, in a nutshell. And the more you learn how to do that, The more integration you have, it's an unfolding process. You're never done. So as you get older and older and older, what we know is that people with more integrated brains have more health, more longevity, more sense of well-being. And we know how to do that. And actually, amazingly, when you see the essence of adolescence, it's exactly what we need throughout the lifespan. So it's actually the essence of living a full and meaningful life. If any of you got a chance to read the Sunday New York Times, you probably didn't because you're here in church, but there is actually an article about the millennials, which are the generation born after 1980, who are now trying to enter the workforce. And the issue was, what kind of life are they having? And they debunked the myths there and said, actually, in these troubled economic times, people are trying to have a life of more meaning. And as you'll see, there's all sorts of studies that actually weren't quoted in the article that support exactly what the article was saying. That we now know when you live a life, we would call in interpersonal neurobiology an integrated life. When you live a life of meaning, connection, compassion, a sense of equanimity, those are all things that come from integration, it's called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is the Greek term, and that's compared to hedonia, which some people just call Las Vegas kind of happiness, So eudaimonia is this deep sense of having meaning in your life, compassion, connection, purpose, and a sense of what's called equanimity, bringing yourself to balance when you're all. So let's look quickly at how the brain goes, because I'm mindful of the time. But if you take your hand model, let's open it up, and let's just review the anatomy. So this will be oriented in your body like this, where the wrist of your model represents the spinal cord, which is what goes down into your body and lets all the different things from your heart and your lungs and your intestines come up, in addition through what's called the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, comes up into the stuff in the head, which we're going to call the brain. But the brain is always embodied, so you never think of it separate from the whole body. And the first part in the head we're going to talk about is your palm, which is your brain stem. And this is the deepest part of the brain. It's most developed when we're in our mother's womb. And this brain stem is very important for regulating things like heart rate and intestinal function. And even if we're threatened, the reaction of fighting back, fleeing, freezing, where you tighten your muscles, or fainting. The 4 Fs: fight, flee, freeze, or faint. And this part of the brain is really important for that. And as you know, anyone in life can have those activated, but the brainstem can sometimes take over. And sometimes it works with the next area of the brain, which if you put your thumb over, this is the limbic area of the brain. You would have 2 thumbs to be a perfect model. Most of us just have 1. I say that because I never used to say that. And one time a person afterwards said I was at a gas station and the person giving me the gas had 2 thumbs. So please honor those people. I said, you're right. So seriously, so most of us have 1, but it would have left and right is the point of saying all that. It's a version. Anyway, okay, so the limbic area has really important functions. It's partially developed when we come out of the womb. And those functions include working with the brain stem in the body to create emotion. So emotion comes from these lower areas. So emotion, number 1. Number 2 is it's very important for motivating us. The limbic area and the brain stem work together for motivation, what drives you to do stuff. And as we'll see, these 2 processes, emotion, motivation, shift when the brain starts remodeling during adolescence. So it's really important to know that. Deep, deep structures are shifting in how they function when you leave your elementary school age years. The third limbic function we need to know about is called appraisal, where basically this is the part of the brain that's evaluating the meaning of things. Like, number 1, is this thing important or not? And if it's important, should I pay attention to it? And if I'm bothering to pay attention to it, is it good or bad? And if it's good, how do I get more of it and feel excited about it? If it's bad, how do I get away from it? That's called appraisal, and it's a limbic function. How many of you think that changes in adolescence? Big time. And a lot of the schools I'm starting to talk to want to know how can they change their curriculum based on the remodeling of what has meaning for an adolescent's life. So people this is another myth, people say, oh, adolescents are lazy and unmotivated. It's so not true. What it is their motivation has shifted, only school has not shifted. You're right? So we keep on thrusting at them contexts that are inappropriate for them. And why don't we just adjust ourselves to what the new science is, instead of calling them names like lazy? Because, of course, we know that if you're called lazy, you will start acting lazy, Right. So I think well, you'll see in a moment. Okay. So that's number 3. Number 4 is certain memory issues that we won't get into today, but memory is an important thing. There's an area called the hippocampus there. It's very important. And finally, the one we will talk about is attachment. Attachment, the 5th limbic function, is how we as mammals need to rely on our caregivers for our support. And what we know in adolescence is let's say when you're 7 and you're upset, who do you go to? Mom. But when you're 17 and you're upset, who do you generally go to? Friends. So instead of parents, you've now moved your attachment system to peers. And that's healthy and appropriate. Now, the changes in the brain have to do not only with the brainstem and limbic area, but our 3rd area of the brain. If you put your fingers over the top, this is the cortex, the outer bark of the brain. The brainstem is mostly developed when you're born. The limbic area is half developed when you're born. The cortex is barely developed at all. So it's going to keep on being shaped by genes that determine things like temperament and stuff. But it's also going to be shaped by experience. This is really important. Experience directly changes all sorts of things. The way we express genes even, but the way neurons, the basic cells of the nervous system, are connected to each other. And that happens a lot in the cortex, but also how the cortex relates to all the other areas of the brain. So what does the cortex do? It's very important for making maps. So if I go like this with my hands, I can tell you exactly where in your cortex you're making some kind of neural firing pattern that is a map of what you see with your eyes. And the interesting thing is no one on the planet has any idea how a neural firing pattern and your subjective ability to be aware of me moving my hands in your vision happen. Nobody knows. So for anyone interested in studying that, if you could figure that out, that would be really helpful. But nobody knows. That's the next book I'm writing is actually about this incredible unknown, for academics to kind of look at that, like what's actually known about it. So the cortex maps things, and there's lots of different areas. The back maps the 3-dimensional world, the side maps the sound world, the upper side maps the physical boundaries of the body, and what's called the parietal lobe. The frontal lobe is where we think and consider and have abstract ideas and all sorts of things about freedom, love, God, compassion, connection, all these ways we can actually imagine things beyond just what's exactly in front of our eyes. Those very important parts of reality can be explored with our cortex, especially in the frontal area. And if you look at the most front part, the front, so in science we don't say front because it sounds like we're having some kind of problem. So we call it prefrontal. So the prefrontal cortex, which doesn't really make sense, does it? How can you be in front of the front? If you're in the front, you're just in the front. I'm in front of the front. But that's what it means, the front of the front. So the prefrontal cortex would be your last knuckles down. And take a look. Let's do a little analysis here. Lift up your cortex. Put it back down. You didn't think you were going to be doing this morning, Ed, did you? Little brain anatomy. So the prefrontal cortex is really important because what does it do? It's linking everything together, basically. It links the cortex, the limbic area, the brainstem, the body, and it's also making maps of other people's minds, which I call mindsight maps. Mindsight is the ability to have insight, empathy, and integration. That's basically what it means. And mindsight maps would be, I have a mindsight map of me, what's going on in my life throughout my whole history. I can make a mindsight map of you based on what I sense is going on inside of you. And I can even make a mindsight map of we, which is the basis of morality. And what this article in the New York Times was saying, they didn't use these phrases, but basically if you have a well-developed mindsight map of we, you have a much more meaningful life. It's a beautiful article. And there's all these other things to say. It's not only a meaningful life, it's a healthy life. And at the end of the Brainstorm book, I actually say to the adolescent and the adult reading it, I say, something, we're raised in a culture to feel like we're a me. And yet there is also this we, but you don't want to get rid of a me. And I used to go around teaching me to we, and one of my students got really upset. She said, "You're saying me to we now." I said, "Yeah, well, is that okay?" She goes, "No." I said, "What's not okay about it?" She said, "We should know our own body. We should know our own history." I said, "Yes." "We should know what has meaning for ourselves." I said, "Yeah." And we should also be connected to other people. I said, "Absolutely, that's me to we." She goes, "No, you're saying I'm leaving me to go to we when you say me to we." I said, "No, I mean like not only me, but also we." And she goes, "That doesn't rhyme." She goes, "How am I going to remember that?" So I said, that's a good point. How about this? How about we? And she loved it. So that's how the book ends. It says, look, we have to savor our lives, really enjoy them, but we also have to maybe not get overwhelmed with the feeling of changing the world or saving the world. How about serving the world? So the adolescent at the end of the book is given the message, it's really important to have a we sense of identity. That's an integrated sense of identity. Differentiating a me and a we, both are important, linking together in one little word with 3 letters, MWE. And that we want to savor and serve. And that each day you can wake up and say, how am I going to savor life? How am I going to cherish life, honor life, have gratitude for life? But then how am I going to serve others? Because that's really what life is about. And I show the science of this so that anyone from any background can embrace it. So let's just finish up, because I know I got to stop and we have to do a Q&A, with what changes in the brain and the essence of adolescence in the next 5 minutes, if I can. Is that okay, Ed? Does that work out? So here's the idea. Instead of it being raging hormones and a period of immaturity, and you just got to get through this period, what we now know, based on studies at UCLA and the National Institute of Mental Health, different places here in the United States, so these are US adolescents that have been studied, is first of all, the adolescent period. How is it defined? It's the period between childhood dependence and adult responsibility. So let's just define it. So it isn't the same as the teenage years. In fact, in the old days, adolescence began around, like 150 years ago, around 15 or 16 years of age. Girls would begin their periods, boys would get sexually mature around that age. And then by around 18 or 19, they'd be settling down with a job and with marriage. So the adolescent period was about 2 years. How long is it now? 25 years. It's long. Well, at least, from these brain studies in the U.S., we know, at least in the U.S., that the changes of the brain that we're going to talk about now go from about 12 to 24. So it's the second dozen years of life. So it's at least 6 times longer than it used to be, and in some cases even longer. There's someone on my street who's still living at home. He's 45. So I'm going to give this to him soon. But we had to make an estimate. So it's about 12 to 24. So about the second dozen years of life. So the one important thing is that adolescence doesn't end when the teen years end. That's really important. And I've spoken with a lot of college students recently, and they're actually happy to hear that. And so we have to reclaim the word adolescence, because people have these expectations like they should know exactly what they're doing and all this stuff. Well, it's not time for them yet. They're still exploring. Okay, so that's the first thing. What's actually happening if it's not raging hormones? It's called remodeling. And the remodeling has 2 components to it. One is called pruning. And pruning, like in a garden, is where you cut away stuff that you don't need. So it's a use it or lose it principle. And it's a little shocking when we saw it. The brain is basically making itself smaller in the number of connections and even the number of neurons. So yes, adolescence is a period of transformation, and the transformation is you're becoming more specialized. So if you think about elementary school, that's a period of just soaking things in like a sponge. Adolescence is becoming more integrated in the sense that you're differentiating and linking. The differentiation comes from pruning. The linkage comes from the second part of remodeling, which is called myelination. Myelin is this healthy sheath that's laid to connect interconnected neurons. It makes their functional way that they communicate with each other 3,000 times more effective. You develop it by skill training. So when you watch the Olympics and you see an athlete do something, you go, oh my God, I couldn't do that. You're right. Because you haven't laid down the myelin so that they're 3,000 times more capable than you to do those flips or whatever else they're doing. That's what laying down myelin does, develop skills. Well, we develop the skills of adolescence based on what we're practicing, what we're doing. So what I say to the adolescent in the book is, if you like foreign languages, if you like music, if you like acting, if you like exploring science, whatever you do, pursue your passions with gusto, because it's a use it or lose it principle in your brain. And you don't have to listen to your parent or teacher telling you that. Those are parent figures. And hopefully they won't think I'm a parent figure as the author of the book. But I say, look, you're empowered to make the most of this developmental period for yourself. So this pruning and myelination is the basis of remodeling that goes on to the mid-20s. And there's an essence I just want to review for you that comes out of it. Now, those of you who've heard me talk before know I have a bit of a problem. Ed is working with me on it. I'm an acronym addict. I love acronyms, and it's amazing, but half of the readers that I have don't like acronyms and half love them. So I want to apologize for those who don't like them and say, here's another one for those who like them. But it's the word essence. Essence itself is the acronym for the essence of adolescence. So let's go over what those 4 things of essence are. ES, emotional spark. If you take your hand model of the brain, we know that the emotions generated from the body, the brainstem, and the limbic area push upward in the cortex more in an adolescent than in an adult. That's just true. And when I learned about it, it was very helpful because one of the ways it pushes is that adolescents will interpret neutral faces as hostile. Any of you notice that? And that was very helpful for me. I'd come home, my 2 kids would be home, I'd say, hi, they go, no, what do you mean? And until I knew what this study was, I was like going, well, I just meant hello. There you do it again, Dad. Would you have a bad day? You know, like this. And I had to realize that, that's their brain getting ready for the danger of the outside world. Someone might say hello to you when you're not ready for it. So, but as a parent, you need to know this. Because literally, this emotional spark has a downside and upside. The downside is it makes you more prone to be pushed around by your emotions. But the upside is it drives you to have passion and a sense of vitality and energy in life, because that's what emotions do. So there's always a downside and upside. We want to optimize the upside, this passion of life. That's the ES, the emotional spark. Number 2, social engagement. We already said that there's a change in the connections adolescents have to move toward their peers rather than their parents when they're upset. This upsets parents. Where's my little baby? You really used to rely on me and now I'm nobody, like this. So you really got to help yourself as a parent. So this book is just as much for parents as for the adolescent reading, because you got to say, okay, they need to do it. Now, why do they need to do it? Picture this. The sun rises. You open your eyes, and someone who loves you like crazy comes and gives you a kiss on your forehead and says, sweetie, what would you like for breakfast? And they make you breakfast, and you get up, you get dressed, you go down, you have breakfast, and you go to, let's say, preschool or something, and you play, and you come home, and you have a little lunch that someone makes for you, and then you take a nap. And then you put some music, you dance around, watch a little TV. They say, what would you like for dinner? They give you dinner. They give you a bath. They put you in bed. They sing you a song, read you a story, and you fall deeply into sleep. Now, who in their right mind would want to let go of that? So nature has to do something with the brain to get you ready to give that up. Most of us, when we get married, we're trying to get it back, right, Scott? So this is nature's way of getting you out the door. So you got to have social engagement with your peers who do not do that for you. And that's okay, right? So you're pushing away from parents. And that's a necessary pushback. And we got to know that as adults, and we got to know that as adolescents. And it's good for the individual to leave home, and it's necessary for our species. In fact, this ability to leave the familiar is what allows kids to brave the unfamiliar and the dangerous, right? That's out in the unknown. Now, this brings up the next one, which is N, novelty. Now, if your brain has got to get you ready to leave the familiar and the comfortable and the safe and go into the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable, and the dangerous and the uncertain, it's got to change something. So it's changing what's called the dopamine system. And this dopamine is the neurotransmitter of reward, and it makes the baseline levels lower, which means adolescents are prone to boredom and utziness. They're restless. They got to do something. And the biggest thing that releases dopamine, so you have a sense of reward, is actually novelty. And so this is part of what happens, in addition to something called hyper-rational thinking, where the limbic area evaluates the exciting things more highly than the risks of something, which it downplays. So adolescents actually know, they're informed about danger. But there's no question you're 3 times as likely to be injured in adolescence or killed than you are at any other time, even though your body is healthier. And this is why. Hyper-rational thinking, which is a skew of the limbic area's evaluative system, de-emphasizing the risks, way exciting the pros of something, And then the dopamine system will get you to try new things. What's the benefit? The upside of that is you're going to have the courage to do something dangerous, which you need to do, because when you leave home, life out there is dangerous. So the brain's got to do something. Now, of course, the downside is you could get hurt or hurt somebody else. So what we want to do, adolescents and adults alike, is find a way to acknowledge this is what's happening and carefully scaffold the kind of experiences adolescents can have where they need to be approaching danger. You know, for leopards, they go out and a young adolescent leopard will run up to a lion, sniff him, look him right in the face, and then run away. You say, well, why is that? Well, because you got to court danger. You got to see what the danger is when you're going to leave the nest. So this is why they got to practice. So hyper-rational thinking, the skew, and the dopamine shifts get you to have this novelty drive. The last one, CE, is creative explorations. The cortex is changing in such a way, and the dopamine system, by the way, influences the brainstem, the limbic area, and the cortex. It kind of goes up and down. That's the dopamine circuit. The cortex, now at the top, it's shifting too during this remodeling period to allow for creative explorations. What does that mean? It means you're thinking about life, the meaning of life, the nature of the world in completely different ways. So a 17-year-old is not just a 7-year-old with 10 more years of experience. There's a whole new way of thinking. The downside of that is you can be really confused, like who are you, what's life about, you question a lot of things, and that can be hard. The upside is, for the individual, is creativity and innovation. For our species, we have gone everywhere on this planet because of the courage and creativity of adolescence. And if you think about it, art, music, science, and technology have all had their major innovations from adolescence, right? And yet we don't treat adolescents like the incredible source of courage and creativity that they have. So what I say to schools, and this is how I'll end it, is, look, we have this opportunity to embrace the new science of adolescence and bring science to life, you know, in this way, where you say, let's make a new curriculum where we allow our adolescents to be engaged in what they're doing, to use the emotional spark, their passion, let's say, to approach the world's problems, to take their social engagement, to teach them to collaborate with each other, which they're naturally prone to do. And what do we do now in high school? Say, get a better SAT grade so you can get to a better, get to a better school so you can get to a better graveyard, right? Like, what's the message we're giving? You know what I mean? So what if we reverse that and say, let's actually tap into your innate social engagement to get you to collaborate with each other. If you like to compete, here's the deal. There are enough problems in this world: famine, violence, climate change issues, pollution, all the different issues we have throughout our whole world. Let's take the 7 top ones and say, you pick one you're passionate about, one of these 7. We're going to be here for you as consultants, not parent figures. And we're going to help you use your novelty. We're going to do these new kinds of things in a new way, and your creative explorations with your social engagement and your emotional spark, the essence. I would bet you if we did that, not only would kids be more engaged when they're in their adolescence, I'll bet you that this important period of life will be a period of life for all of us on the planet. We'd have new solutions to these old problems that we adults have not been able to figure out how to solve. That's the promise and the purpose of adolescence. Thank you very much.
So I promise you all will try like hell to have Dan Siegel back. Thank you for being here. He's going to stay here and sign books and book plates of his new book. Now's the time to buy Christmas and Hanukkah gifts. Thank you very much. Dan Siegel.